Josh Hasten here, Israel Uncensored, Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com. It is the 6th of November, 2017. The Hebrew date is the 16th of Cheshvan, 5778. I am here with my main man, Benjamin Bresky, broadcasting once again from Jerusalem. Make sure you get in touch with me during the week, Josh at thelandofisrael.com, on Facebook, Joshua Hasten, and on Twitter at Josh Hasten. And before we get started on today's show, we just have to send our condolences to the people of Texas after last night's massacre at a church. Not all of the details are in at this point, but we do know that at least 27 people were murdered in a church near San Antonio, Texas last night. They were talking about this morning on the radio the identity of the one who carried out this massacre, but we don't have a motive at this point, at least. We don't know what exactly went down there, but just a horrible incident, horrible scenes from Texas. So the prayers of the people of Israel to the people in the U.S., to the state of Texas. If anything develops within the course of this recording, we'll go ahead and bring that to you as well here on the Land of Israel Network. And just a horrible scene there. Now, switching gears, we are going to go to the phone, actually the Skype to be more precise, to speak to Seth Frantzman, op-ed editor of the Jerusalem Post. He's also a columnist for the paper and does a lot of writing for the paper. A lot of the writing he's been doing lately has to do with the overall situation in the Middle East, whether it's Iraq. I know he has made trips to Iraq and done some reporting from there, or the situation vis-a-vis Hezbollah, Lebanon, Iran, everything going on in the Arab world. It's an honor to have him on the show. Seth, welcome to Israel Uncensored here, Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for coming on the show this morning. There's a lot to talk about here. The first issue, I definitely want to talk about your experiences in Iraq, but I want to start with what's in the news right now. Specifically with what's going on in northern Israel alongside the Golan border there. There was an incident 2 days ago in which a Syrian Druze town was attacked, came under fire, and I want to ask you if you can give us an update on the situation in that Syrian Druze town and tell us the ramifications for northern Israel, whether it's the Druze community, northern Israel, or just Israel as a whole. If you can't explain the situation there.
And what happened in Hadar, right, basically?
Yes.
On the border? So basically what's interesting is, there's Druze that live in Israel, there's Druze that live in Syria, and there's Druze that live in Lebanon. Because if you go back to the Ottoman period or the period before that where the Druze come from as a religious group, all these borders we have today don't exist. I mean, these are basically kind of European imposed borders. So in the Golan, as many people know, Israel conquered the Golan in 1967. There were Druze there that stayed in the Golan. But they have family and friends that live just across the way in Syria. And so for them, in terms of their worldview, those are just other Druze, just like Jews in Israel would see other Jews that live in another country as just more people like them. So once the Syrian civil war started, the Druze that were in that village came under threat from Syrian rebel groups. And the reason for that is because the Druze are obviously a non-Muslim religious minority, and some of the Syrian rebel groups are obviously jihadists, who basically are like, ISIS or Al-Qaeda and hate, groups that are not of their sort. So there became a very complex situation on the border where the Syrian regime, because the Druze tend to support the Assad regime only because they want government protection, were basically, occupied by the regime. And next door to that, very close to Israel and the Golan, were a bunch of Syrian rebel-held villages. So from Israel's point of view, you had this very strange kind of mosaic or carpet just across the border where you would look at one village and say, well, that's Syrian rebels, and the next village next to it is run by the regime. And in theory, there's kind of a war going on there. But for the last few years, there's been different layers of sort of ceasefire. So you don't see a lot of fighting directly along the border, because as people have been to the Golan, no, it's just across the way. So what happened on Friday was that a Syrian rebel group, which is alleged to have been mostly affiliated with what is called the Nusra, basically, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, tried to break through the regime area near that Druze village to get to another Syrian enclave, which is on the other side of that village, which was under siege by the Assad regime. And during that attempt to go around there, they used 2 suicide bombs of some sort and killed 9 people in the Druze village or near it. And this caused a lot of Druze from Israel to go up there to the Golan and basically demand that demand that either Israel intervene or basically show their support for their comrades across the valley. And Israel basically released a message saying, we wouldn't let that village fall, this village of Hadar. But the reality is the village of Hadar was never really threatened to the village itself. It was just these bombings had struck near it. So it seems that basically in the end of the day, nothing's really happened. I mean, there were some people killed. The regime took back the little area that they held there. And it's gone now back to the quiet that it has existed for like 6 months or something before that.
So in terms of Israel's security in that area, I mean, I guess you have 2 different possibilities. One being that the regime, and when I say regime, I'm talking about the Assad regime with support of the Iranians and Hezbollah, either they control that area or you have an Al-Qaeda affiliate controlling that area. I mean, which one is better? Which one is worse? I mean, what is more dangerous? We know Hezbollah is probably the greatest threat, but in terms of the actual border area, what is Israel most concerned about that could possibly happen in that region right now?
Well, that's the thing that Israel's had to ask itself for the last 6 years as it has basically watched the war across the border. Which of these 2 bad scenarios would you like to have happen? Which is, do you want jihadists to win or do you want the regime to hold on? Look, in the beginning of the Syrian civil war, there was some sort of concept that perhaps the rebel groups there were non-jihadists and most of them were just fighting for democracy. But over time, more and more of those groups became, closer to radical elements. The thing about the groups on the Golan is you have a whole series of little villages run by Syrian rebel groups. Most of those Syrian rebel groups are really quite moderate. So they're not really jihadists. They're basically local groups of Sunni Arabs who basically hate the regime. So Israel has quietly, I wouldn't say worked with those groups, but quietly allowed humanitarian access and things, and has a relationship with those rebels. It doesn't have a relationship, obviously, with the jihadists or the extremists. Israel's interest, and why does it have that relationship with those rebels, is to keep the Hezbollah and those parts of the regime forces like Iran away from the border. So Israel likes to have this little buffer zone. The thing about the Syrian regime is that, the reality is not since 1973, the Assad regime was not necessarily a bad neighbor. It was technically at war with Israel, but there was no real problems on the Golan. So, it's the enemy, it's the devil, right? And I think that basically where Israel is today is everyone knows that the Assad regime is eventually going to win the war, but it's going to take a very long time for it to do that. So eventually the Assad regime will come back to the border. The question Israel is asking is, okay, who are the Assad regime's friends? Well, its friends are Russia and Iran and Hezbollah. Israel doesn't want Hezbollah and Iran on the border, but Israel doesn't really mind Russia, which is why, of course, Netanyahu, for instance, has one of the closest relationships in the world of any world leader with Vladimir Putin, which is basically a security relationship. So Israel is trying to kind of balance these forces, and Israel has also made it known over the years with a lot of airstrikes, I think about 100 in the last 2.5 years, airstrikes in Syria against weapons transfers to Hezbollah. Israel has made it known to the regime, don't do X and Y, and if you do X and Y, we will bomb you. So the regime also understands the kind of weird balance, I think.
Got you, and it is definitely... it can be confusing with so many different groups vying for power and control over there. But as you just said, it appears that the regime will remain in power at the end of the day. But at the same time, you have another bombshell in the news. In the midst of all of this, Lebanon's Prime Minister al-Harari, you reported the other day, he quit. He was, I believe, in Saudi Arabia and went on television and said that as a result of what's going on in his country, vis-a-vis Iran's influence and Hezbollah, even though Hezbollah was essentially embedded or is embedded with the Lebanese army up there in Lebanon, he is stepping down for fears. He's fearing for his life. I mean, his father was assassinated, and he says he fears for his life. Talk, if you can, about the situation in Lebanon on Israel's northern border, and what does it mean now that that Harari has, in fact, stepped down?
Well, I look, Saad Hariri.
Hariri, excuse me.
I don't know how to spell his name exactly. But
al-Hariri, yeah, we'll go with that.
His father was killed, I think it's 2005. His father was murdered by a Hezbollah and also the Syrian regime, basically massive bombing. This then led to the Syrian regime, which used to occupy Lebanon, basically leaving. And there was a short flowering of kind of awakening of democracy and stuff in Lebanon. And then, of course, what happened was, as many people recall, the war between Israel and Hezbollah. And then Hezbollah began to flex its muscles in Lebanon. And over the last 10 years, it has basically taken over many parts of the state. It takes over parts of the state, not openly in the sense that Hezbollah flags fly everywhere in Lebanon. It takes over pieces of the state quietly, for instance, by getting elected, a certain number of people elected to parliament, and then using its presence in the parliament to blackmail the system so that it has a stranglehold over who's elected president, and making sure that its friend, who is now Michel Aoun, becomes president. Saad Hariri was kind of the last major power player in Lebanon, or one of the last major power players who stood against the kind of Hezbollification of Lebanon. Saad Hariri is not really a strong man. He was the son of a very powerful prime minister. But I think symbolically, he tried to basically fight against this in a quiet way. And Hariri was also born in Saudi Arabia, and he's a Sunni Muslim. So for the Saudis, he was kind of their boy. And it all kind of came together over the weekend, which is Saad Hariri flew off to Saudi Arabia and in a televised address basically resigned and has decided to basically stay in Saudi. So it's part of a Saudi game, I think, to challenge the Iranian Hezbollah presence in Lebanon. Which, look, Israel also likes that, because Israel doesn't like the fact that Hezbollah has basically grown in leaps and bounds in its power. I mean, Hezbollah is deeply involved in the Syrian war. Hezbollah has ambitions all over the region. Hezbollah activists have been in Iraq. I mean, all sorts of dangerous, dirty things. So, taking away Hariri creates instability in Lebanon. Some people say that it means it takes away the nice veneer or facade of Lebanese politics and makes it clear to the world that Lebanon's occupied by Hezbollah. I'm not sure if I think that will change things much, because if we know about what we know about Iraq is that Iraq also has all the Shia Hezbollah-type militias that are run by Iran in Iraq. And you'd say, well, wait a sec, shouldn't America and the world then be putting sanctions on Iraq? And yet America is, the Iraqi government's closest ally. So it's not clear what will happen with Lebanon.
I'm glad you brought up Iraq. That's the next thing I want to ask you, because I know, how many times have you been over there covering the situation in Iraq?
Kurdish region at least 6 times, I think.
Wow,
and,
amazing.
And also covered the war battle in Mosul, and I covered the war against ISIS for those years, and I was in a lot of different places, like where the Yazidi genocide took place, and I was in Kirkuk, which was recently taken over by the Iraqi government, and all that.
Well, I would say you're brave for doing so, for going over there to Iraq. I don't know if I would be willing to take that chance, but I want to thank you for your reporting from there, from the front lines. But right now, I mean, all indications are that Iraq, which, what I've read, even from the Jerusalem Post, is essentially turning into an Iranian proxy, and their military is being bolstered or supported, or maybe perhaps even being perhaps directed, and you can enlighten us, by the Iranians. And at the same time, and you'll have to explain this, I don't understand why the Western world, aside from, I guess, Israel and maybe a few other countries, aren't trying to support as much as possible the Kurds of Iraq. To me, that doesn't make any sense. And I know you have a ton of experience being over there. So share, if you can, with us the situation with the Iranian influence in Iraq, and which is actually funded and supported by the United States and the Western world. And why aren't we helping the Kurds enough?
Well, the Kurds in Iraq, of all the Kurdish groups for many years, were the one group of Kurds out of like 20 million or so in Turkey and Syria and Iran that had a kind of autonomy. Because after the war against Saddam Hussein in 1991, the Kurds basically had a no-fly zone, and they kind of had their own area that they ran up there. And in 2003, after the American invasion, the Kurds basically became officially an autonomous region. And that region became the safest region in Iraq, to the extent that there were basically no suicide attacks, and to the extent that it had new modern airports, and started to look like a city that you would look like a city in Turkey or something. I mean, basically a normal place, and not really Iraq, in the sense of Iraq conjures up images of suicide bombings and Al-Qaeda and all sorts of bad things. What's interesting also is at the same time that was happening, the Iranians, obviously, because the Shia are now basically a majority Shia Muslims in Iraq, Iran was able to exploit that, just like it does in Lebanon, to create all these parallel frameworks alongside the government. So you have Shia militias and this and that. When ISIS attacked Iraq, and obviously ISIS in some way in Iraq, or at least Sunni jihadism, was a response to the kind of pro-Iranian policies of the former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. ISIS was able to overrun all the Sunni cities, all the Sunni Arab cities. So it wasn't a surprise. You can quite clearly see how, these different groups align themselves differently. And now that the government of Iraq, with America's help, with the help of 70 countries, I think, in the coalition that's anti-ISIS, the government of Iraq has finally defeated ISIS after 3 years or so, right?
Right.
And now the government of Iraq has decided to attack the Kurds because the government of Iraq, backed by Iran, sees the Kurds as kind of not just a threat, but sees them as basically trying to break away from Iraq and want to have independence. So the government of Iraq wants to flex its muscles. Well, ordinarily you'd say, okay, well, let them fight it out or something, I guess. The problem is that the Americans are the ones arming the Iraqi government. The Americans are training the Iraqis. And up until a month or so ago, the Americans were also arming and training the Kurds. So you say to yourself, wait a sec. Now you've got two different allies both fighting each other. The Kurds ostensibly, in many ways, not only have they traditionally been relatively close to Israel, but the Kurds have been close to the West. And as I said about terrorism, they were able to keep their area secure and stable and terrorist-free for the last decades. So wait a sec. Why is the Americans, or why is Europe and the Americans allying with the Iraqi government in Baghdad when everyone knows the Iraqi government in Baghdad has visits by all this Iranian minders and stuff like Qasem Soleimani and all these people from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and all those bad actors? It's not really clear, but the Americans seem to think that somehow, if they're just really nice to Iraq, then it won't really be taken over by Iran. It will actually somehow become closer to Saudi Arabia. Even though the fact is you have members of the Iraqi government and members of the Interior Ministry, all of whom served with the Iranian army in the 1980s fighting Saddam Hussein. These people are openly similar to Hezbollah. So it's not clear what the Americans are doing. It's very, very disappointing to see that no one has stood by the Kurds because they didn't have to go in there and start another war with Iraq. All they had to do was send a few diplomats to the Kurdish region to make it clear that there was kind of a red line. And they could have negotiated something. I think, unfortunately, America and the West tends to abandon its allies. You see this time and again. Why did Barack Obama, for instance, want to work with Iranians and not Israel? Right. Why is it that the West so often talks about democracy, talks about human rights, but then you ask yourself, well, wait a sec, why are you always allied with the wrong side of things? Why are you so close to Pakistan and all these regimes that are basically almost evil? Pakistan's a country that executes people for blasphemy. How can any self-respecting democracy be friends with Pakistan? But they all are. So it's a really disappointment to see what's happened with the Kurds. And they've been basically screwed by history because the type of people that run governments today don't really care about values. They care about all sorts of other weird, cynical things. And unfortunately, that means they hand the region over to Iran.
Well, it's a scary and disappointing reality, as you pointed out. And for those who haven't seen the images, by the way, of the Kurds in the streets with Israeli flags, that's something to be seen if you haven't already seen that. And they definitely deserve our support. Truly disappointing. Let's try to finish on something positive if we can. Unfortunately, with the world around us crumbling, I know one thing that's positive is, thank God, life is great here in Jerusalem. What do you have for us, Seth? Maybe something you're working on, maybe an article you're working on, something positive going on here in our country before we let you go.
Well, recently I've been doing a piece basically looking back 100 years since the Soviet-Russian Revolution. And it was interesting to me to find that in the 1930s, right before his death, Leon Trotsky was interviewed. And he was asked about the Jewish issue. And he said, I thought that the Soviet Revolution that I was a part of would basically solve the Jewish question and Jews would just become regular people and that, the proletarian revolution or whatever would have all this out. And he said, well, we can see that anti-Semitism basically still exists. And then they asked him, what about all these Jews in Palestine? And he said, yeah, well, they're basically surrounded by lots of Arabs, and that's just basically a death sentence. They're going to they'll just be slaughtered basically when war comes. I'm not just paraphrasing what he said. And I was thinking back 100 years, kind of funny how wrong he was, that actually the Jews in Europe were the ones that ended up being slaughtered. And the people here in Jerusalem and what became Israel were the ones that actually won out. And the ones that actually, if you went back 100 years, the people that made the choice to move here were the ones that were making the smart choice. So I think sometimes, when people give you all this doom and gloom about history and say, well, you don't understand, blah, blah, actually, you know what? They're wrong. A lot of times, things sometimes do work out.
And thank God it's working out here rather nicely, even with all our issues and problems. And sometimes we see disunity here, but thank God Israel's the place to be. And this is where your future is. If you are listening to this broadcast and you are debating whether you want to come home to Israel, this is definitely the place to be, no doubt, as the world, it seems, is crumbling around us, whether you're talking about the Middle East, whether you're talking about, I don't know, Texas or Las Vegas or all these other crazy things happening. Not that everything's perfect here, but this is definitely the place. This is the place to be. Seth Frantzman, op-ed editor for the Jerusalem Post. Check out his columns in the newspaper as well as his reporting. And as he mentioned, he has been over there in Kurdistan, Iraq, 6 times, reporting from the front lines here in the Middle East. I want to thank you for your time today. Thanks for joining us. It's great to have you on, and hopefully we'll have you on again here in the near future. All the best. Have a great day. This is Josh Hasten here, broadcasting from Jerusalem. That is going to do it for us here today. Just again, want to send our condolences to those in Texas as a result of that horrible shooting in a church yesterday in the San Antonio area. We pray for you here in Israel, and I'm sure as the day goes on, we're going to hear more and more about what exactly went down there, what exactly happened, and eventually maybe we'll find a motive. I don't even think that, I don't know, at this point, Ben, have they talked about the Las Vegas shooter's motive? I don't even know if we've gotten there yet with that, but we'll keep you posted. That's going to do it. Get in touch with me during the week, Josh at thelandofisrael.com, on Facebook at Joshua Hasten, on Twitter at Josh Hasten. Shout out to Ben Bresky again. Without him, there's no sound. We cannot make these productions happen. Check out all the great shows on the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com. My name is Josh Hasten. Most importantly, between now and when we talk again, please God, next Monday, everyone out there, be safe. Shalom, shalom from Jerusalem, Israel, the capital of the Jewish people. Have a great day. Have a great week, everybody.
It's much more real than any reality show. It's much more dramatic than any drama. It's much more funny than any comedy. It's like a game show, but it's no game. It's our lives.
Listen to Inside Israel Today with Gil Hoffman, political correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, every week on thelandofisrael.com.